The air in the community hall was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, a permanent film of boiled vegetables and bleach. Simone moved through it on autopilot, the heavy stainless steel ladle feeling like an extension of her arm. 19 years old, halfway through a nursing degree that was wringing every dollar and every waking hour from her, and this was her penance. Her choice. Her exhaustion was a physical weight, a second skin she wore under her faded scrubs. The man beside her, the one she knew only as Min, moved with an unnerving economy of motion. For 3 weeks he'd been here, every Tuesday and Thursday, never speaking unless spoken to, his hands moving with a fluid precision that seemed out of place among the clatter and chaos. He chopped onions without his eyes watering. He scrubbed pots with a focused stillness that was almost meditative. He was a paradox, a whisper in a room full of shouts. His stillness was what made her notice him. In a place defined by desperate need and harried charity, he was an island of calm. Today, he was on ladle duty with her, serving a thin, hopeful stew into an endless line of styrofoam bowls. She watched his hands. They were clean, the nails perfectly cared for, a stark contrast to the worn-out setting. They were not the hands of a man who needed to be here. "You're quiet today, Min," she said, her voice raspy from fatigue. She didn't need an answer. It was more for her own benefit, a way to puncture the monotonous rhythm of dip, pour, pass. He glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable. A flicker of something, maybe surprise, crossed his features before being suppressed. There is little to say. His voice was low, a smooth baritone with an accent she couldn't quite place, clean and precise like the rest of him. She gave a short, humorless laugh, sloshing a bit of stew onto the counter. "Tell me about it. After my anatomy midterm yesterday, I think my brain is officially out of words." She wiped the spill with a damp rag. He was already passing a fresh bowl to the next person in line, his movements seamless. He didn't react to her small talk, but he didn't dismiss it either. He simply existed beside her, a pocket of intense gravity. She found it strangely comforting. He wasn't trying to fix anything. He wasn't offering platitudes. He was just there, serving. A man with immaculate hands and a silence that felt older than the city itself. She wondered, not for the first time, what brought a man like him to a place like this. But she knew better than to ask. Everyone here had a story they weren't telling. His was just written in a language she didn't understand. The first sound wasn't the glass shattering. It was a collective, sharp intake of breath from the line of people outside, a human vacuum that sucked the noise from the room for a single, horrifying second. Then came the explosion of the front windows, a crystalline roar that showered the linoleum floor with glittering death. Simone flinched back, dropping the ladle with a deafening clang. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Screams erupted, a chaotic symphony of terror. People scrambled, tripping over chairs, desperate for cover that didn't exist. Her nursing training screamed at her, assess the situation, find the injured, but her body was frozen, locked in place by pure, primal shock. Through the jagged maw of the broken window, she saw them. 3 men, dressed in dark suits that looked unnervingly formal for the violence they were enacting, moved with predatory grace. They weren't looking for money. They weren't random thugs. Their eyes swept the room with cold, professional intent. They were hunting. And then her gaze snapped back to the man beside her. Min hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched. He had simply straightened to his full height, his body shielding hers from the open doorway. The quiet volunteer was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely, his stillness no longer calm but coiled, a predator waiting for the precise moment to strike. He grabbed her arm. His grip was not painful, but it was absolute, an iron manacle she could never hope to break. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice the same low baritone, but now stripped of all warmth, leaving only chilled steel. The air crackled around him. The change was so instantaneous, so complete, it was like watching a mask drop to reveal a face of carved granite. The men saw him. A flash of recognition, of fear, crossed the lead attacker's face. He shouted something in Korean, a harsh, guttural sound. Min didn't reply. He simply moved. He pushed Simone behind the heavy steel serving counter, a solid wall between her and the unfolding nightmare. She hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. The sounds were muffled now, wet and brutal. A sickening crunch of bone, a choked cry. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind refusing to process the images her ears were creating. It was over in less than a minute. An impossible, terrifying minute. Then, silence descended again, heavier and more menacing than before. The only sound was the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears and the soft, measured tread of footsteps approaching her hiding place. She held her breath, praying it was a ghost. A hand settled on her shoulder. She yelped, scrambling backward until she hit the cold metal of a cabinet. Min crouched in front of her, his face unreadable in the dim light. There was a small, dark splatter on his cheek, and she knew with a sickening certainty it wasn't stew. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, cataloging her terror. He seemed completely untouched by the violence he had just wrought. His breathing was even, his hands steady. It was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. He was a machine of perfect, deadly control. He was the most powerful man in the room, a Korean mafia boss facing down his rivals, and she had been standing next to him serving soup. The absurdity of it was a bubble of hysteria rising in her throat. "You are not hurt," he stated. It wasn't a question. She could only shake her head, her throat too tight for words. "They saw you with me," he said, his voice flat, analytical. "They will think you are important." A weakness, he paused, letting the words sink into her terrified mind. "You cannot go home. You cannot go to class. You cannot be alone. You will come with me." This time it was a command. There was no room for argument in his tone, no space for refusal. He was not asking for her cooperation. He was informing her of a new reality. Her reality. She stared at him, at the man she had known as a quiet pot scrubber, and saw the truth. He was danger. He was violence. And he was, for some reason she couldn't possibly comprehend, her only chance of survival. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a mournful sound that signaled the end of her old life. He stood, pulling her to her feet with that same inescapable grip. "We are leaving." Now he led her through the back, away from the carnage, and into an alley where a black sedan waited, silent and sleek, its engine already running. It looked like a hearse. The car moved through the city like a phantom, the windows so darkly tinted that the world outside was just a blur of muted colors and distant lights. Simone sat pressed against the door, trying to make herself as small as possible, trying to create a universe of space between herself and the man in the passenger seat. Min, she couldn't think of him by any other name, had not spoken since they'd left the alley. He stared straight ahead, his profile a sharp, unforgiving line against the city's glow. She was a specimen in a jar, a problem he was transporting. The car smelled of expensive leather and something else, something metallic and clean, like antiseptic. The silence was a living thing, expanding to fill every inch of the space, pressing down on her until she felt like she couldn't breathe. She was a nursing student. She patched up scraped knees and took blood pressure. 20 minutes ago, her biggest problem was a failing grade in anatomy. Now, she was in a car with a man who moved like a dancer and fought like a demon, a man whose enemies had just shot up a soup kitchen. Her mind was a frantic scramble of questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Who was he? What did they want? What was going to happen to her? She risked a glance at him. He was utterly composed, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He was the eye of the storm, and she had been swept into his orbit. The car eventually turned off the main road, gliding through a set of imposing iron gates that opened without a sound. They drove up a long, winding driveway, the headlights cutting a swath through a forest of manicured trees. The house at the end was not a house. It was an estate, a monolith of glass and dark stone that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. It was cold, beautiful, and utterly soulless. It was a fortress. Inside, the silence was even more profound. The floors were polished black marble, the The walls were stark white, adorned with single, expensive pieces of art that seemed more like specimens than decorations. A woman in a severe black dress appeared, bowed to Min, and then looked at Simone with professionally blank eyes. "Show her to the West Wing guest suite," Min said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous foyer. "Get her anything she requires." The woman nodded once. "Yes, Mr. Kwan." Kwan. So he had another name. A real name. The woman gestured for Simone to follow, and she did, her worn-out sneakers squeaking almost comically on the pristine floor. The suite was larger than her entire apartment. It had a sitting area, a bedroom with a king-size bed, and a bathroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury spa. A wall of glass looked out over a silent, perfectly landscaped garden. It was a beautiful prison. She stood in the middle of the room, her thin hoodie feeling utterly inadequate, her body trembling with delayed shock. She was safe, she supposed. But she had never felt more trapped in her life. This was the world of the Korean Mafia boss, a world of silent efficiency and sterile beauty, and she was an unwelcome, messy variable within it. He found her an hour later, standing by the glass wall, staring out at the darkness. She hadn't moved. She hadn't touched anything. She felt if she sat on the perfect white sofa, she would leave a permanent stain. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a long moment before he spoke. "You have questions again, a statement, not a question." She turned slowly, wrapping her arms around herself. "A few," she managed to say, her voice a thin thread. "Who are you? Why were they trying to kill you? Why am I here?" He walked into the room, his presence immediately shrinking the space. He stopped a respectful distance away, but his intensity was a physical force. "My name is Kwon Min-jun," he said. "And I am what you would call a businessman. My business has aggressive competitors." The euphemism was so blatant it was almost insulting. "You're a gangster," she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "A mob boss." A flicker of something amusement? Respect? Passed through his eyes. "A more direct term, yes. I am the head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate. The men who attacked the center were from a rival organization. They have been trying to disrupt my operations. They failed. And the soup kitchen? What was that? Part of your operations?" The question was sharp, accusatory. "No," he said, and for the first time, a hint of something unreadable, something almost pained, entered his voice. "That was separate. It was for me," he didn't elaborate. "They saw you. You spoke to me. You were familiar. In my world, familiarity is leverage. They will assume you are my property. To hurt you would be to hurt me. I brought you here to control that variable. You are here because you are safer as my prisoner than you are as a free woman." The cold logic of it was devastating. She wasn't a person to him. She was a variable. A strategic liability. The powerful Korean mafia boss had assessed the situation and moved his chess piece off the board. She was that piece. For a long time, Simone didn't say anything. She just stared at him, at his perfectly tailored suit, his impassive face, the dark splatter she could still imagine on his cheek. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but underneath it, something else was stirring. A hot, defiant anger. "I'm not your property," she said, her voice low but clear. "I'm a nursing student. I have a life. You don't just get to take it." He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "I already have." From Kwon Min-jun's perspective, the girl was an anomaly, a disruption to a system he had spent his entire adult life perfecting. He watched her on the security monitor in his office, a small, defiant figure in a room designed to intimidate. She was pacing now, a caged animal full of nervous energy. He had seen fear in her eyes at the soup kitchen, the raw, animal terror of a person confronting their own mortality. But here, in the cold, sterile safety of his home, that fear was being tempered by something else. Indignation. He was not accustomed to indignation. He was accustomed to fear, respect, greed, and hatred. Those were the currencies of his world. This girl, Simone, operated on a different economy entirely. He had watched her for 3 weeks at the community hall. He went there as a form of quiet penance, a ritual to honor a memory he kept locked away. He had expected to be invisible, another pair of hands. But she had seen him. She had spoken to him, not with the deference his own people showed him, or the fear his enemies did, but with a casual, weary camaraderie. She had complained about her anatomy midterm. She had treated him as if he were simply a man. An equal. The concept was so foreign it was almost jarring. Now, she was a complication he could not eliminate. His enemies, the tigers, were clumsy but persistent. They operated on brute force and saw weakness everywhere. They would have noted her easy manner with him. They would have already been digging into her life, her schedule, her family. Leaving her to fend for herself would have been a death sentence, and for a reason he could not yet articulate, that was an unacceptable outcome. It was a strategic miscalculation on his part, allowing himself to be seen in such a public, vulnerable setting. But the cost of that miscalculation was now her life, and that debt fell to him to manage. He zoomed the camera in on her face. She had stopped pacing and was looking at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw the exhaustion there, the fear, but also a core of resilience that fascinated him. She was not broken. She was angry. He was the undisputed Korean Mafia boss of the city, a man who could make fortunes disappear and people vanish with a single phone call, and this 19-year-old girl with worn-out shoes and a stubborn chin was looking at his world and finding it wanting. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in his chest. It was not pity. It was a quiet, unnerving sense of wonder. The first few days passed in a haze of luxurious monotony. Simone woke up in a bed softer than a cloud, ate food prepared by a silent chef that tasted like nothing she had ever experienced, and wandered the cavernous, empty rooms of the mansion. Minjun, she was trying to think of him that way now, was a ghost. He would be gone when she woke up, and she would only see him at dinner, a formal, silent affair at a dining table that could have seated 20. They would eat, the only sounds the clinking of silverware on porcelain. He would watch her, his expression unreadable. She would focus on her plate, trying to ignore the weight of his gaze. It was a strange, suffocating domesticity. On the third day, she found the library. It was a 2-story room with floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with books in Korean and English. It felt like the only room in the house that had a soul. She pulled a worn copy of a poetry anthology from the shelf and sat in a leather armchair, losing herself in the words. It was the first time she had felt a flicker of her old self since the attack. When he found her there that evening, she didn't startle. She had become attuned to his presence, the subtle shift in the air that announced his arrival. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, and for once, he didn't look like a businessman. He had taken off his suit jacket, his tie was loosened, and she could see the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes. He stopped in front of her chair. "I did not know you were a reader." "There's a lot you don't know about me," she replied, not looking up from her book. He was silent for a moment. "That is true." He walked over to a wet bar in the corner of the room, and she heard the clink of glass. He returned and set a glass of water on the small table beside her. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. An acknowledgement. An offering. She looked up at him then, really looked at him. She noticed the threads of silver at his temples, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was not a monster. He was a man. A very dangerous, very complicated man. He sat in the armchair opposite her, the vast room shrinking to the space between them. The silence returned, but this time, it felt different. Less like a void and more like a shared space. A fragile truce. She noticed a thin, clean cut on the back of his hand, beaded with a tiny drop of blood. It was probably nothing, a paper cut from the world of his business. But the nurse in her, the part of her that was hardwired to fix and to heal, took over. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice soft. Before she could stop herself, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. His skin was warm. He froze, his entire body going rigid at her touch. She ignored it, turning his hand over to inspect the cut. It was minor, but it was a flaw in his perfect, controlled facade. She pulled a tissue from her pocket, pressing it gently against the cut. His eyes were fixed on her face, his expression one of utter, profound shock. He looked at her as if she had just performed a miracle. In his world of violence and transactions, this simple, unasked-for act of care was something he had forgotten could exist. The attack came without warning, just after midnight. A series of muffled thuds from the perimeter of the property, followed by the shattering of glass in a distant part of the house. This time, Simone wasn't frozen. Adrenaline, sharp and cold, flooded her system. The truce was over. The real world had found them. Minjun was in her room before she could even process the sounds. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in black tactical gear, a pistol held with casual familiarity in his hand. The transformation was absolute. The quiet man from the library was gone, replaced by the lethal predator from the soup kitchen. "Stay here. Do not leave this room," he ordered, his voice a low growl. He was about to leave when a volley of automatic gunfire ripped through the hallway outside, splintering the heavy oak door. He cursed, a sharp, violent word in Korean, and shoved her toward the ensuite bathroom. "In here. Get in the tub." "Lie down," she didn't argue. She scrambled into the large porcelain tub, curling into a ball, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. He barricaded the bathroom door with a heavy marble vanity chair and then stood beside it, a silent sentinel in the dark. The sounds of the fight were terrifyingly close now. Shouts, gunfire, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Through it all, Minjun was a rock of terrifying calm. He was breathing slowly, listening, calculating. He was in his element. This was his business. And she was right in the middle of it. A burst of gunfire stitched a line of holes across the bathroom door, sending shards of wood flying. He didn't even flinch. He was waiting. For what, she didn't know. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Then, a soft click from the door handle. He moved, a blur of motion in the darkness, and the world outside the door erupted in a final, terrible symphony of violence that ended with a heavy, final thud. The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. She could hear her own ragged breaths, the frantic, panicked rhythm of a trapped animal. 20 minutes passed, then 30. She stayed curled in the tub, every muscle screaming with tension. The door creaked open. It wasn't him. It was a man she didn't recognize, his face obscured by a ski mask, a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand. A scream died in her throat. He saw her, a slow, cruel smile spreading beneath the mask. This was it. This was how it ended. But before he could take a single step, Minjun was there, appearing from the shadows of the bedroom like an avenging ghost. He moved with a speed that wasn't human. The fight was silent, brutal, and mercifully short. When it was over, Minjun was standing over the body of the intruder, his chest rising and falling heavily. He turned to her, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the shattered window, she saw him. Not the cold, controlled mafia boss. Not the efficient killer. His face was a mask of raw, unfiltered terror. A terror that was not for himself, but for her. He stumbled toward her, falling to his knees beside the tub. He reached out, his hand shaking, and gently brushed a stray piece of wooden shrapnel from her hair. His control was gone, shattered into a million pieces. The man who commanded a criminal empire, who dealt in death and fear, looked at her with the eyes of someone who had just seen their entire world hanging by a thread. And she was that thread. He pulled her out of the tub, wrapping her in his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a tremor run through his powerful frame. He was shaking. The invincible Kwon Minjun was shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Simone." "I am so sorry," he said her name like a prayer, like a talisman against the darkness he had invited into her life. He led her out of the ruined suite, past the bodies of his men and his enemies, his arm a protective shield around her. He took her to his own bedroom, a stark, minimalist space that offered no comfort except for his presence. He sat her down on the edge of the bed and began tending to the small scratches on her arms from the flying debris, his movements gentle, almost reverent. The Korean Mafia boss, the leader of the Golden Dragon Syndicate, was cleaning her wounds with an antiseptic wipe, his large, calloused hands surprisingly tender. "This was my fault," he said, his voice low, guttural. "I brought this to you. I exposed you to my world." He looked up at her, his dark eyes stripped of all their defenses, leaving only a raw, devastating vulnerability. "When I saw him, when I thought he would reach you, I understood something." He paused, swallowing hard. "My life, my money, my power, none of it has any meaning if you are not safe. It is all worthless," he was confessing. Not to a crime, but to a feeling so profound it had broken through a lifetime of armor. "I do not know how this happened. You are light. And I have lived in darkness for so long, I forgot it existed. And now I find I cannot live without it." He finished cleaning a scrape on her elbow and his hands fell away, leaving her skin feeling cold. He looked down at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "These hands have built an empire on violence and fear. They are not fit to touch you." He stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to her, presenting the same formidable silhouette he had on the first day. But she saw it for what it was now, not a wall, but a cage. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I have stolen your life, your peace, your future. I can give you money. I can set you up in another country, with a new identity. You would be safe. You would be free of me." He turned to face her, his expression grim, resolved. "Or, you can stay." The words hung in the air between them. "Stay here. With me. Not as my prisoner. Not as my liability." He took a deep breath, the sound of it raw and exposed. "As my wife." It wasn't a proposal. It was a plea. A desperate, hopeless bargain from a man who had never had to bargain for anything in his life. "I cannot offer you peace. I cannot offer you a normal life. I can only offer you all that I am. All my protection. All my devotion. My entire world, dark as it is, will be yours to command. I love you, Simone." The declaration was quiet, devastating in its sincerity. It was the truth, laid bare at her feet, bloody and complicated and terrifyingly real. He was offering her a crown, but it was forged in fire and worn in a kingdom of shadows. He was the most powerful Korean mafia boss in the city, and he was offering to kneel. All she had to do was decide if she was brave enough or foolish enough to accept.